The second thing you can do is, journalists really do, and their editors really do listen to what people have to say. And a well thought out email or letter will get a response and will be listened to. Another issue I would encourage you to do is to reach out to journalists and, encourage them. We always are looking for good stories. And sometimes, the truth is that the journalistic coverage on Israel tends to focus on the conflict. And that's, unfortunately, the nature in some ways of journalism. 100,000 planes take off every day and land safely in America. Nobody does a story about that. But as soon as a plane crashes, if you were a Martian and came from Mars, all you'd think is that you'd say, I'm never getting on one of those. All I hear about is plane crashes. Israel, until recently, this is changing a little bit, was also overcovered. They did a survey in China among Chinese high school students, and they asked them, how big do you think Israel is? And they said, about twice the size of China, based on the media coverage. Now, why is there so much emphasis on Israel coverage? There's a few reasons. First of all, Israel is the largest recipient of foreign aid from the United States. Over $3 billion in economic and military aid. The military aid, by the way, has to be spent in the United States with American companies. Secondly, I think there is a real affinity between the American people and Israel, and especially among the evangelical Christians who have a real interest in Israel. I've met quite a few evangelical Christians living in Charleston, and many of them have webcams tuned to the Western Wall, and that's the first thing that they look at in the morning, and there really is this very strong. Thirdly, and not to agree with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, but there does seem to be a fairly heavy Jewish presence in the media. And I think some of that does have an effect on how much coverage there is. More important is that people have generally, newspapers, radio, and TV, have centered their Israel coverage centered their Middle East coverage in Israel, because Israel had excellent telecommunications, satellite facilities, all of these things, and it's a very nice place to live. So correspondents would be based in Israel, and from Israel would cover the broader Middle East. Now, some of that is changing as foreign bureaus all over are shutting down because of budget issues. I think, the over-coverage of Israel by its nature means that you're going to have more critical coverage of Israel because you're doing a lot more stories about Israel. However, I would encourage all of you, journalists often, we don't necessarily have that much background. If you have interesting feature stories that you think, would make good stories, I would encourage you to sort of contact journalists, develop relationships with journalists. One thing that I think the Israeli government sometimes fails at is developing those relationships with journalists. For example, at the airport, journalists are often harassed. I'm not. I speak Hebrew. I'm Jewish. But I've seen my colleagues get incredibly harassed. Now, we all have press cards from the government press office. On these press cards, I should have brought it for show and tell, is a little silver circle. And that silver circle looks like a little piece of aluminum foil. And whenever we go to a press conference at the Prime Minister's office, they take one of those loops and they look carefully through it. And that is a seal saying that we've been investigated by the Israeli intelligence services. That means that every journalist coming to and from Israel who has a press card has been checked out by the security services. Now, why are they being harassed at the airport? The government press office should have somebody sitting there saying, welcome, what can we do to help you? Do you need a ride to Jerusalem? Do you need, what can we do to help you? Secondly, the bureaucracy. The Israeli army has a huge bureaucracy. So when you need an answer to a question, you call up and you get these very nice little soldier girls who say to you, I will check on that and get back to you. The answer comes if you're lucky, in 3 hours, sometimes the next day, and it's basically a one-sentence answer that they read to you. We need, on the other hand, when you want to talk to a Palestinian, I have in my Rolodex, the home numbers of half of the Palestinian Authority. So I think Israel has to do more in terms of hasbara, in terms of making their case known in a way that's, and Israel has to do more in terms of pitching feature stories that have nothing to do with the conflict. I think coverage is changing, and I think there is an interest in these kinds of stories. But journalists need to know about them. They don't necessarily read the newspapers in Hebrew. They don't have the connections. When they first come, they should be welcomed. There should be, in other words, the Israeli government should be courting journalists instead of seeing them as a potential threat. Lastly, the question of access. During the last conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, almost 2 years ago, they sealed Gaza, and they said journalists can't get in. The only way to get into Gaza here is through the Erez crossing point in the north. The Erez crossing point, if any of you have been there, is huge. It looks like an airport. It was set up originally to allow Palestinian workers to come into Israel. There used to be 200,000 Palestinian workers in Israel, and then at the time of the first Gulf War, there were a series of attacks on Israeli employers, and they said no more Palestinians, and have since hired hundreds of thousands of Thai workers and Nigerian workers, and foreign workers present their own problems, and they're now the same, similar to what Germany's having to other Western countries with a large population of foreign workers. Israel is now having those problems as well. And I actually think another thing that should be done is that Palestinian workers should be encouraged to work in Israel. They can go through a screening process. They can be, they were actually going to issue them magnetic cards that after they went through a security screening. And I think the fact that, Israel really has an interest in making sure that the Palestinian economy is steady. And I think that Israel's making a mistake by hiring hundreds of thousands of foreign workers instead of Palestinian workers. Beyond that, I think that, so the only way to go into Gaza is through that northern crossing point. The only other way is to go through Egypt and go in here through Rafah. So the Israeli government said, we don't want any journalists. It's not safe. There's going to be Israeli troops and tanks all over the place, and we don't want to have to worry about the security of journalists, despite the fact that every time we go to Gaza, we sign a waiver saying if anything happens to us, we don't hold the state of Israel responsible. If we get kidnapped, we don't want them to come get us. We sign all of these things away. So what happened, and basically what they thought was, if they don't let the journalists in, there won't be coverage. Well, that's just silly in today's day and age. So what happened? There was plenty of coverage, but it came from Palestinian cameramen who live in Gaza, who weren't providing the context. I'll give you one example. Some of you may remember there was an Israeli-fired artillery shell. Now, Gaza is very densely populated. In that little strip, there are 1.5 million Palestinians, and 1 million of them, more than 1 million, are completely dependent on the United Nations for food aid. So what happened? Israel fired an artillery shell that, according to the first reports, landed inside a United Nations school, killing 40 people. Now, had there been foreign journalists there, the first thing you do is go there and see what really happened. It turned out a few days later that it wasn't fired at the school, it was fired near the school. Then it turned out that there had been rocket fire from that area. So had you had foreign journalists there, immediately those things would have been, those things would not have been broadcast. And to come up with the correction 2 or 3 days later is simply too late. Nobody reads corrections, as you all know, and nobody really cares about them. I honestly and firmly believe that journalists are really not trying to sabotage anybody. They want to get it right. They want to have relationships with both sides. They try, most people, to come to Israel is the pinnacle of your journalism career. It's not something that, it's not a first assignment. It's well-seasoned journalists who have worked very hard They're not coming with an agenda. Do they make mistakes? Sure, we all make mistakes. And now, given the pressures of the internet and having to turn everything around immediately, you have even less time to sort of check what you're doing and make sure it's right. But I really think it's important that the Israeli government do everything they can to help us, not to hinder us. I will just end with one thing, and I'm happy to take questions about any of this or about the peace process. This is Linda Gradstein reporting live from the University of California, Santa Barbara Hillel. Thank you very much.